Hello, so today's idea is based on um, an article that was published in 1935 by Edward Sapir. It was originally published in the Encyclopaedia of Social Sciences called Communication. So, what Sapir is doing here is giving us a concept of social communication. I found this article. This article was cited in Walter Buckley's article about society as a complex adaptive system. So I thought it was interesting to check, what this article had to say about the concept of social communication. And it was amazing how in 1935 he already had certain ideas of how communication was going to have such a large impact in society at large, and I will go ahead and explore some of these ideas. So, what Sapir is proposing is that, again, very much like Buckley, he's proposing that society is not a static. It's not static, right? It's something that is always changing, and it changes due to the processes of communication, because these processes of communication are needed for the building up of society. So things are changing in society, the forms, the institutions, the associations in society are changing due to the sort of network of partial or complete understandings between the members of particular organizational units. So society as an organizational whole has different units, and it's an organization unit in itself, but the understanding between the members of such units, and Sapir doesn't use the concept of complex system here, right? But if he is speaking of different organizational units, and that society as a whole is composed of smaller organizational units, you can sort of read this as society as a system of composed of subsystems. But in 1935, you wouldn't see still a lot of the systems thinking. It was the early beginnings of process philosophy. So he is speaking of processes of communication. So it's already leading to the idea of systems. So the society as an organizational unit, as this organizational phenomena, is constantly reaffirmed by acts of communication. And these acts of communication, they create social behaviors and then cultural patterns that change according to the way that communication flows, the processes of communication happen in the organization. He also, well, this is, of course, it gives us the idea of how a process will change over time as well, and then how society will change, both the cultural patterns and the social behavior patterns, based on the information that flows through society, through the organization. But this is that this information is exchanged through acts of communication that are either explicit or implicit, right? And that these explicit and implicit acts of communication, they give to the individual members of the social organization, it's it allows for it forms its social experience. And what he says that it's the difference between the explicit and implicit communication is the explicit is language, right? A form of explicit communication is language, speech, the verbal exchange of information, right? That's very explicit. But implicit is in the sort of the body language, the gestures, the sort of different meanings that are formulated in particular cultures that can only be understood by members of that particular culture. So he really explores this topic as to say, if a Chinese person is, was born and raised, he has this sort of sensibility to kinds of communication that are not explicit, they're not exchanged through language, and therefore can communicate better within that social organization than somebody from, let's say, France would, because the French person is not used to the implicit, the sort of sensible exchange of information that happens through, just cultural memory or soft understandings of that culture. So he really emphasizes the fact that, well, there is an importance of unformulated and unverbalized communications in the act of communication in particular social groups. And it says that, well, language is the main vector, right, for information flow, for these acts of communication, and that these are explicit. And the function of language is to articulate and rationalize the full content of informal communications in the individual social experience. So the individual will formalize through language, but it also communicates in other implicit ways as well. So this act of having this act of communication that is implicit shows kinds of different kinds of behavior, and how different kinds of behavior have certain significance. So in particular cultures, people will act certain ways, not just because of that culture, but because it also has different meanings, and that is also a part of an act of communication. So he does enter the topic of modern communication, and now here we have to situate the article in 1935, which is pre-cybernetics, right? So pre-computers. But he's already talking about this sort of far-reaching communications. I think that he mentions telegraphs or morph codes and certain communication tools that they had at the time that were already minimizing geographic distances. And to him, that would create the sort of situation, like the far-reaching, geographically far-reaching communication technology would have a tendency to remap the world psychologically and sociologically. This would have an impact. And now, this to me was very powerful, because now in coming to 2020s, right, to the 21st century, we see how communication and information technologies, particularly through social media, is really establishing certain certain situations of that it sort of guides psychological phenomena. So with the famously known experiment from Facebook, where they were trying to influence the user psychologically, that was in the early sort of conversation of how social media was impacting people's mental health, things like this. But nowadays, I think that this conversation is more consolidated to understanding that social media is created in a way that will have like an intimate impact in people's psychology. yeah, I'm a bit out of good choices for the words here, but yeah, so the tendency to remap the world both psychologically and sociologically was the sort of already understanding in Sapir's notion of social communication. And he says that the weakening of the geographical factor in social organization uh, could could in the long run, he says, well, must in the long run, so he sees this as something that will happen, but that it will profoundly modify our attitude towards the meaning of personal relations and of social classes and even nationality. So he really thinks that this will have a profound impact. The advancement of communication technologies, the way that it not excludes, but it diminishes the difficulties of geographical distances, will have a profound impact in social organization. I think this is important, and I think that this is an argument that enters in the concept that is very recent. It's still a bit of an incipient concept, but Levy, Pierre Levy, I think he's from the University of Toronto, if I'm not mistaken. But he's proposing this concept of platform states, which is yeah, so which is provoking the sort of understanding that there is a shift of political organization in society. And this is happening because of communication and information and communication technologies, right? So how platforms, they have people who are linked to certain platforms, them in itself are forms of social organization, and that the argument in certain theoretical lines within political sciences and social sciences is that you would have this sort of shift from nation states to, more technologically formed, technologically, like say, bound, technologically bound social organizations. So now we still very much see social organization as in the form of nation states, and how nation states, they became these institutions, and then these institutions are supposed to regulate social behavior, the individuals in society and so on. But then this sort of not emerging, but this growing line of argumentation within the international relations of social sciences, not internationalist, political sciences and social sciences, is that this agency of regulation of social behavior and social life in general is shifting towards technological platforms. So Sapir is already giving some kind of provocation, some kind of points towards this kind of change due to communication and information technology. So and he says that, well, the most important of the obstacles to communication in the modern world is the great diversity of languages. And I believe that's, well, in 1935, he was speaking of languages in terms of natural language, right? So English, Spanish, French, Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, Japanese, and all of these other different languages. But I think that after cybernetics and the advent of computer technologies, then that got even more aggravated, because then you have a whole set of programming languages, and then you have this sort of situation in which human communication that happens, in the form of natural language, has to travel through the technological systems and be sort of translated, or I call them transducted, into different forms of language so that it can run within the artificial systems and then be retranslated, so that the end user could understand. So I think that nowadays, in the 21st century, this fact that language, the diversity of language, is a complication, it's an obstacle in the way of social communication, is even more aggravated in social technicals, in modern 21st century notion of social technical systems. I think that's it. It's a very short article, very profound, a bit difficult to read, but amazing because it was written in 1935, and it gives us a very important, it points to a very important question of the importance of communication in social organization. This is also something that Niklas Luhmann will point in his theory of society, that in social systems, communication is the key operation, in the systems. So this is it for today. Thank you.